before Hunger Games 1984, or what most of the world has even heard of as the word dystopia, there was Brave New World. Aldous Huxley gave us a dark vision of the high price for perfect society. That's basically the discussion we'll be having. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hello, hello.
And yeah, I think one of the things that kind of comes up, with a lot of sci-fi overall is its influence or impact on our actual society and stuff. So I think the question this time is like, how have movies and these different stories about utopia or dystopia, actually affected, our actual, things in the modern world, so to speak?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because on one side, you can sort of say that dystopian or utopian stories are always a reflection of their times or issues that are going on in that particular time period. But what's interesting for me about Brave New World is that a lot of the predictions in it seem to have gradually become truer and truer over time. And they seem to have very much focused in on particular trends. But I think you can say that there are certainly, whilst you can't accurately predict scientific or innovative advancements from reading a sci-fi novel, because by now we should all have flying cars if we were going by the predictions of the 1950s. Right. Where we have more control over things like purely aesthetic things like fashion and trends and all this kind of stuff, you do see these kind of self-fulfilling prophecies. Like there's always this sort of thing of, if you going back almost 100 years, if you look at what people's visual perception of what a future home or a future workplace would look like, it's very minimal. There's very few sort of surfaces. Everything is kind of seamlessly integrated. And everything in our homes seems to be, well, there's certainly a trend which very much sort of goes in that direction. So it's kind of, if there's enough people who have buy-in about what the future should look like, it does become realized, I think. And
I think you and I talked about offline how there's been this kind of trend towards like this kind of industrial look, like kind of even in homes, like so like I sometimes I feel like what's become like kind of the model home nowadays is stuff you see like in a South of Market, in San Francisco startup and stuff, like kind of where you have a lot of exposed brick or like pipes and all that kind of exposed. Like it seems like that's kind of the hip thing to do, is like kind of have that kind of style that you would see in the workplace and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think we talked about this before in terms of like the places where people no longer go to work actually become like the fashion trends for home decor. But hardcore kind of ultra modernism or futurism hasn't really changed that much since almost like the early part of the 20th century. If you look at like some of the architecture there, it's just big glass walls, very minimal, and it's that hasn't really changed a huge amount. And it seems like any other trend is really just a more of a kind of a look at something traditional. I mean, likewise, it seems like there's an overriding trend in all sorts of things where, things have to have lights to make them more futuristic. If things have lights, be it sneakers, be it, anything else, it's like it's futuristic.
Right.
And it's funny because we always like make fun of these 70s sci-fi movies where they have panels of blinking LEDs that have no kind of indicators of where they are. But in a way, though, that's actually not so much a reflection of the information that's trying to be conveyed, but actually now we have banks of blinking LEDs because it's called chromotherapy in your bathroom shower, or it's kind of like an effect that you have on like a wall that's just supposed to there to look pretty and things like this. So it's almost like the blinking LEDs are there just to show everything's normal, I guess, is how you would do it. So it's weird in that it's supposed to be a representation of information, but it's actually kind of like almost becomes like a comfort thing. Right. And it's a weird sort of this is our comfort space for what we perceive as the future in a way, in terms of things like this. But that's a very specific thing. But I can, there are definitely cases where, dystopias are always supposed to be a warning what we shouldn't do. And that isn't always the case.
And I think also, the other ironic part is that like certainly nobody, architects or plans to create a dystopia, right? Like for them, their vision was supposed to be this utopia. So in other words, it always starts off being kind of like this grand plan that was to make the world a perfect place, and yet something kind of goes awry and goes off track and stuff like that. And here we are, right? And I guess that's kind of really like the lead into like kind of we'll be covering, of course, the 1980 version, the 1988 version, and more recently the 2020 version. So yeah, let's start off with the 1980 version. This one, as you kind of talked about, you have the banks of blinking lights. So you have like kind of the very typical sci-fi kind of things where people are in jumpsuits and stuff like that. It's very much looks like, even though it's 1980, it very much looks like 70s sci-fi. I mean, that's like kind of like or what you see when a sci-fi movie in the 70s portrays as the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it still doesn't look like a very high budget version.
No.
Of the tale, but it does, as we probably both agree, it sticks pretty closely to the original storyline of the novel, and it's quite long as well, over 3 hours.
Yeah.
So it's
So I thought that for me, one of the things that kind of was most striking out of the different ones we'll be talking about is that they actually start off showing Linda and John's origin story, where basically. We like, whereas the other ones just basically in the discussion or narrative, it's like, Linda's explained as to how she ended up, there in the wilderness and stuff in the savage lands. But in this one, they actually show it like kind of where, she and this director guy, are off kind of on trip and then, things kind of really become, there's this accident that she ends up, getting injured. But meanwhile, she's pregnant because I guess in this one she's a little bit airheaded with her monitoring her birth control, I guess, and stuff. And so I thought that was interesting that they actually showed that first, and because that kind of caught me off guard, and I was kind of expecting like a lot of the other ones focus right away on the Bernard, Lenina and John triangle and stuff like that. They try to get to that as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we sort of briefly mentioned, John as a character sort of serves two purposes, in that in one respect he's there to contrast against whatever's been established as the society in the future, but he's also, in certain versions of this, an audience surrogate.
Yeah,
in that you're supposed to sort of identify with him and his sort of shock against whatever this new society is. I mean, did you feel that in the 1980 version, John was that audience surrogate, or did you think it was more Bernard Marx?
Yeah, I feel like that's probably like the big weakness that we'll be seeing throughout each of these versions of stuff, is that like I feel like each time the filmmakers aren't sure who they want to be the central, kind of character, stuff like that. So they kind of go back and forth a little bit, or try to, and I think that's like kind of. So this one, partly out of the different ones, like where they kind of make him almost like a literal savage and stuff, where like, he's kind of got this scruffy beard. He looks like kind of, actually even in the Savage Lands, like it seems like they're not just like kind of something in a post-apocalyptic world, like it was, like Mad Max, or whatever, but they seem to be actual like, cave, savages and stuff like that. And I thought that was like kind of like a little bit off-putting, like we're like, what's that about? Like, kind of thing. I guess I was gonna say, I guess we should mention that, like, both you and I actually, have gone through the original novels, stuff like that. And I think that's like an interesting kind of thing that I think a lot of people going into these versions don't necessarily do and stuff like that. Yeah,
I actually heavily encourage John to do that, because it's one of my favorite books. And after I was so taken with Brave New World that I ended up sort of reading most of Aldous Huxley's back catalogue. It was most of his bibliography after reading it, because I was so impressed with it. But as I will explain later, there's an interesting reason why this book is so different from all his others, which I'll go into later on. But yeah, did you actually enjoy the novel going through the audio book or the novel?
Yeah, Michael York was a fantastic narrator, of course, and it was like kind of to me like it. I think having done that, and I wouldn't say it was the first thing I did because actually the first thing I did was like back in when the '98 version came out. I actually saw it when it came out, stuff like that, and
Right.
so it was good not only as a reminder of what the story was, but I feel like then I realized like what like kind of what the '98 version really condensed to, as we'll kind of get down into. So it to me like there's a kind of rhythm to the way the dialogue slash kind of the writing and stuff like that that of course you get from somebody reading it to you, and that is really kind of hard to capture then. And it's the typical kind of book versus movie thing and stuff like that. So going into the book, I think really helped me to understand what Aldous Huxley was looking to achieve and stuff. And yeah, I mean it just you felt like you were immersed in this kind of world that these things all the things that we'll be talking about happens, and you have a sense that like the kind of almost, I don't know what I'm trying to think of a way to put it, but the closest way I could describe it is that like what kind of Brazil does for a bizarre kind of future and stuff like that. That's kind of what I feel like his writing kind of captures, is like kind of this bizarre world that's been created and stuff.
Yeah, I would say in a nutshell, the structure of the book is that he throws you into this kind of very strange future and then contrasts it with something that's actually more back, further back in time than contemporary time. And I think that's what they've done in the 1981. They've stuck quite closely in that the savage lands are kind of pretty primitive. They're very much sort of like going back to almost sort of tribal rituals and things like this, much like the book. Yeah, I mean, and then it's sort of, there's a lot of exposition in the book as well. A good third of the book is just people describing things, which is okay in a book, but it really doesn't translate very easily to a film format, which is why I think there's a number of sort of issues and or strengths with each version, really. And I would say, well, the main weakness really of the 1980 version is that it's so close to the original source material that it doesn't make for a very compelling movie, unfortunately, because it's very hard to portray a lot of the stuff in a very sort of linear movie format, really.
And I think what was kind of really interesting to me is they have this actor Burt Cort playing Bernard Marx, and they really make him like kind of this kind of little scrawny, kind of not even nerdy, but like kind of just really like a dreamy kind of guy, stuff like that. And and so I gotta kind of give him credit for like kind of capturing it. Apparently that was partially the intention, but I guess in my mind, maybe because of the influence of seeing the '98 version, and also from even after kind of the audiobook and stuff like that, that's not what I pictured as Bernard Marx. I pictured like somebody as kind of maybe like maybe bureaucratic and stuff like that, but not necessarily kind of like this this character that like kind of is just really, to say it's hard to like is like kind of probably like an understatement. Kind of this kind of guy that like sometimes you just like kind of, I guess you can kind of see, especially in the 1980 version, why like he's kind of cast aside, or why like kind of he's like kind of really what's it called, almost like an outcast right away and stuff like that. But I feel like as for the audience, then like it's again gets to that thing where like I really found it hard to find anybody to consider like the protagonist or who I could really relate to and stuff like that in this version.
Yeah, I mean, from what I remember of the 1980 version, I mean, in terms of Bernard Marx's character, he's someone who's supposed to be, who always has this understanding that he's supposed to be at a certain place in society, but just hasn't got that because of the alcohol in his decanting bottle. And so he's embittered and disenchanted with the society, which allows you to relate to him, because he points out some of the the problems with the society, but also it's mostly fueled by his own sort of feeling cheated by his circumstance, really.
Right.
So he's a very kind of selfish character in that respect, but still interesting to sort of identify with him in certain aspects of the story, I'd say.
Yeah, and the other thing that was striking for me was that casting African American actors, or just black actors for like Mustapha Mond and the other character, I'm trying to remember the name now. Helmhotz Watson stuff. I thought that was an interesting choice. It definitely, I felt like it was effective in that it showed like this future where, there isn't kind of the race thing and stuff like that we've seen in other kind of movies, whatever. And at the same time, it was, like actually, Ron O'Neal as Mustapha Mond was like kind of interesting because he goes on to, or actually, I'm trying to think whether he does that beforehand. The Superfly. Oh, I guess that was before that. He had made his mark in the Superfly movie and stuff. So we'll be seeing him in that.
Yeah, that's quite a leap from Superfly to Mustapha Mond. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's funny. It's not really overtly race isn't really kind of addressed too heavily in the book. But there is this whole kind of rather dodgy kind of feely scene where they have kind of interracial sex and things like this as entertainment for people, but it's kind of seen more in a sort of, I guess, kind of exploitative kind of context, I would say, in the book rather. But I mean, there are other bits where they say that, they've had to kind of basically eradicate history and culture so that people can't reflect back on it to challenge the current society. So in that, if that is the basic doctrine of the future society, then you would have to kind of basically erase racial history and level the playing field in order that people didn't kind of go back to their own kind of histories or ethnic roots in order to kind of challenge the system. So it's kind of it's whilst it's not explicitly stated, it's kind of the conclusion you draw from the whole kind of way the Brave New World Society works.
And as we'll see in like the different version, what they do instead is artificially create races where you're an alpha versus beta versus gamma, so it's funny how like, okay, they got rid of one form of racism and they, substitute it for another kind that way they can have worker bees versus, upper echelons to kind of, manage things and stuff like that. So, I think that's the, one of the biggest ironies of the book and these different versions of stuff like that. And certainly we'll be going into like kind of how each of these versions kind of how they approach it, how they adapt it. So in the 1980 version, they're very explicit about kind of like like not only just the dress code, but also like they make like the lower classes like look like these aliens, and like kind of where it's like kind of like and I guess in the book they even describe it that like they not only genetically modify but also like kind of do things to kind of alter their physiology to be adapted to low light if they're expected to be working in mines or in harsh kind of environments and stuff.
Yeah, the epsilon semi-moron, I think, is the way they sort of call them, which I think is a great term to use for them. But yeah, so there's, basically they're short. Everything is very much sort of, they're shorter and get progressively larger. And I think the 1981 is fairly faithful in that it does visually represent the different sort of castes of the system. Which is not represented, I would say, in the following versions. But and how would you say I would say Soma is fairly accurately portrayed in the book. In the 1980 version to the book.
Yeah, I think so. I think for that part, it just basically shows it as something that's dispensed, and I think what's interesting is that the other ones show the people popping it more often. This one you really don't see it other than like very exceptional moments and stuff like that. In fact, it's almost comical, as we'll kind of get into the later versions, how some was used.
I mean, I would say those are the most things. I mean, did you feel like, because depending on the version, Mustapha Mond or Bernard Marx tends to be the kind of surrogate, no pun intended, bad guy.
Yeah.
In a lot of these, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think this one definitely captures that. Where Bernard Marx turns out to be kind of like very, like you said, self-interested, and that basically he's more out to like kind of apparently climb up this the social ladder and stuff. Mustapha Mond, I don't know about villain per se in this one. He just seems to be kind of like just the enforcer. He's just there to basically carry out what he's designed to do and stuff like that. And I think that's overall the shift we'll see is that like how that's interpreted, because sometimes they're a little bit almost like kind of the Dr. Evil kind of thing and stuff, and other times they're just kind of just just a middle manager, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so if it's not obvious to viewers, I didn't actually watch all of the 1980 version. I only kind of dipped into it. I watched it a few years ago, but I'm doing it mostly from memory. But Lenina is pretty much an accessory kind of character from what I remember.
Definitely.
And which really only leads us to John as the other sort of character to focus on.
Yeah.
And I suppose from what I remember, this is fairly faithful to the book in terms of what happens to his character.
Yeah, and again, as always, major spoiler that for him to hang himself is something that like we actually don't see in the other versions, which is interesting.
No.
But I feel like at the same time, because overall, he's kind of like, again, I just felt like I didn't really identify with him as a surrogate for the audience. That then when he hangs himself, it's like, oh well, like kind of I didn't feel the tragedy of the moment and stuff, as I feel like we kind of will in the upcoming versions and stuff, and I think that's probably like the one major weakness of this version and stuff is that like it's very faithful. It's absolutely like kind of given its limited budget and all that kind of stuff, it just really is like true to form to the original, the source material of the novel stuff. I think that like I think the way maybe they were maybe a little too faithful with John, that like that made it like harder to kind of to identify, because it felt like he was just spouting Shakespeare as this kind of like, I just didn't really like, I knew why from the book that he did it, but I felt like the way they did it, like it was just kind of, it just seemed, it was very jarring, like kind of it seemed like like almost like ridiculous in a way, like kind of like why is he just kind of constantly like kind of spewing Shakespeare. I think it like the book kind of explains it a little bit in the sense that like you get more of the or at least felt like that like the way it was kind of done in the book, it just seemed like a part of his character. But this one, it seemed like, I don't know, it just seemed like it just made him even stranger, I guess.
Yeah, I think the main difference between John's character in the book and how it's portrayed in a lot of the versions actually is that in the book, he's obviously a very poetic character because he's attributing these sort of classic bits of Shakespeare to these different scenes. But this is also kind of juxtaposed with Aldous Huxley's very kind of neo-modern satirical wordplay on how he describes the various things. So it actually blends much better because you have this kind of quite funny kind of satirical wordplay on how he describes that in a very cynical way, this society, and that, but you don't get that sort of depth of insight into John's character from the different situations in the movie. It just seems like all of a sudden he's spouting Shakespeare, and then that's it.
That's exactly it. I think that like it did feel more like commentary, like his commentary as we're kind of seeing things through his eyes, like you said, in the book. But then here he just seems like kind of just every now and then he just kind of is going off,
Yeah. So all in all, did you enjoy the 1980s version?
Yeah, I did for this, like kind of just the fact that like it was like it felt very much like a 70s kind of sci-fi movie and stuff like that. I felt like it was it achieved a little bit of what Logan's Run ultimately did and stuff like that. Like Logan's Run was very much a world that you kind of got sucked into and everything like that. So it achieved some of that.
Yeah, I would say in a way, Logan's Run is almost like a better cinematic adaptation of Brave New World, in that it has a lot of the similar themes of sort of like an organized society with death that's kind of, programmed in, and, the main pursuits of pleasure being the main kind of pursuit, thing that people do with their time. Everything is very sort of organized and automated for them within this world. So yeah, it's almost,
and you have an expiration date and stuff. So I mean, of course, it was just like the core kind of story and stuff. I think that's the route they did, was just kind of focus on that aspect and stuff.
Yeah, and that a lot of sort of traditional human values and things have all been left to the outside world, which is now kind of a post-apocalyptic wilderness. So yeah, it's kind of like, again, I would say Logan's Run is almost like a slightly adapted, condensed version of Brave New World in a way. So it's quite fun having Michael York reading the audiobook in that. That's
true. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah. But, I would say, though, if anyone's listening to the audiobook, the bit where he does the solidarity ritual is like, I was kind of listening to this in bed, and I'd fall asleep on it. And normally it was like that. I don't know if it's chapter 7 or something. Every time I would wake up to Michael York sort of shouting orgy porgy, frolic and fun over and again, and just that's quite an intense chapter. But anyway, so
yeah, surprised it didn't affect your dreams and
Oh, it probably did. Yeah.
Oh no.
So I guess we'll move on to the 1990. Talking of Reader's Digest and condensed versions, I guess we got the 1998 version.
Yeah, and that's really what we have here. It's surprising that like they packed it in. I think it was 90 minutes thereabouts, and under 2 hours. Short. And I felt like they really, it's really just the Reader's Digest version of it that like they really condensed, kind of what happens, and for better for worse, right? As we'll kind of see. So here we have Peter Gallagher as the role of Bernard Marx and stuff, and then Leonard Nimoy making a cameo as Mustapha Mond and everything. And then some of these other actors are not nearly as well known, stuff like that. But I thought that they did a really good job of like kind of really capturing their roles and stuff like that of John and Lenina and stuff.
Yeah, and of course you've got Miguel as Henry Foster.
That was a surprise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's a kind of a different take in that you've got Bernard Marx as kind of the hero of this one, I would say. He's nowhere near as self-interested. It's more to do with him discovering his sort of relationship with Lenina, really, and what that it means. Henry Foster is clearly the bad guy in this one. So they've kind of done a fairly kind of Hollywood archetypal version of it, in that Bernard Marx has the hero's journey, and Henry Foster is the kind of villain. So and Lenny,
because Miguel Ferrer does it well. He just,
I know, right?
It's like if as we talked about with like kind of different actors choosing them. If you want a villain that kind of people really right away like kind of root to kind of knock off, just hire Miguel Ferrer. I
know, right? Yeah, and I mean Lenina is kind of, I don't know the actresses. I can't remember. She's not very familiar to me.
No, she's had mostly television roles and stuff, and
yeah, and she's still. It's funny. She gets a lot of screen time in this. And she does. She is still a little bit of a. She doesn't feel so much like an outsider, but more like someone who's just kind of curious about the outside world.
Right.
And it's really her romantic ties to Bernard that make her different from everybody else.
Yeah.
But she's only really comes into her own right within the last 5-10 minutes of the movie, I would say. That's really when she gets any sort of agency as a character, really.
Right.
So yeah, she's pretty much unchanged to some degree from the 1980. Mustapha Mond, I think, is a kind of an interesting one in this, because Leonard Nimoy is quite accepting of all the different sorts of plot twists and turns that take place, and John as a character. And in the book, he's a very kind of derisory character of world on the outside and John, and he's very, very much kind of against any sort of change to the stability of the system. Whereas in this one, he's sort of like, oh well, let's give it a go. Let's see if our system can tolerate some weird outside influences. And also he's dressed very much like a kind of an Indian guru in this.
Right.
And he's wearing kind of like an orange robe, which is very kind of reminiscent of a Indian guru. And instead of having he's got like some synthetic orange beads, which I think was an interesting kind of interpretation of that.
I felt like they hired him as like a surrogate for like kind of a Spock kind of character that he's there to basically goes, let's see what's logical to happen here.
Absolutely, yeah. Sort of the purely cerebral take on any of the emotional chaos that's introduced by John.
Right.
And I mean, and John is a kind of he's still fairly faithful to the original, I would say. And in this one, he does sort of. Although the major difference here is that the Savage Lands have changed. They're now much more contemporary.
Oh yeah.
Which basically now makes John more of an audience surrogate. But because we've already kind of got attached to Bernard Marx and his romantic kind of subplot, he's still kind of an accessory character.
Yeah, I felt like overall what they were looking to do was just to make it more, make the overall story more accessible, because they used a lot of very modern things. Like rather than kind of having something that was like previous version where it's very much like this kind of sci-fi kind of setting and stuff like that. I think they were trying to appeal to like a contemporary audience, and to have something that like, okay, this is like not so distant in the future what could happen and stuff. I feel like that was like kind of the key statement that they were looking to make.
Yeah, and I think as well, I guess in the late 90s, there was a lot of experimentation with genetics and engineering, and it didn't seem too far away that we would be kind of manufacturing people and things like this, which is probably where we got things like The Matrix from.
Right.
There's a lot of imagination about that.
And then I don't know if you noticed, but like I felt like what they were showing too for the feelies was like kind of rave parties, which ecstasy is really like such a substitute, right, for soma.
Totally, yeah. I mean, I think someone probably even, I wonder if they took ecstasy at some party and thought, oh, we could do a Brave New World take on this, because I mean, soma is an engineered drug to create euphoria. And it was the de facto drug, synthetic drug of the 90s, basically. So, I mean, it makes sense to have it almost in this rave party kind of scenario. But it is funny in that, I mean, the book is obviously much more extreme in that, because all of these things end up in orgies, which is obviously you can't necessarily do on a TV movie. But, it was interesting to see, and most of the alphas just seem to be advertising executives, which is kind of true to the book, but they, they're wearing kind of contemporary 90s clothing, which is also quite sort of throws you off a little bit.
But I just think it's just so ironic though, right? That like, here you have like these, like they're portraying rave parties, which at the time that was the thing and stuff like that. So I guess in a lot of ways they're showing like kind of, like, hey, this is like, something that like isn't so alien, like I think one thing that we haven't mentioned yet is that the original book was written in the 1930s, right? So some of these different things are like so out there for the people of the time and stuff. But then here we have this version that's showing the stuff that's basically going on, for the most part in the time period, like in the 90s and stuff.
Yeah, drug-induced euphoric dance parties, which is exactly what kind of Aldous Huxley predicted in 1931, but that they were, we were living it, or at least the lucky ones of us were living it in the 90s. But so certainly we got a lot closer. And of course, genetic engineering was really sort of starting to take off in the 90s. They were cloning sheep and things like this, so it did feel very contemporary in that respect. But also, I'm guessing from a budget perspective, I mean, it's obviously a lot cheaper.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. To basically, have your directors say, okay, we need to kind of set up a rave party and stuff like that. I mean, basically they probably just hired extras that were like, just straight off this, street that kind of, just came from a rave party and stuff like that. So yeah, that probably wasn't too much of a budgetary strain and stuff.
No, and I think the definition of savage in 1998 was clearly, according to the producers, a cowboy hat and a leather vest and a few tattoos. Because there's that scene where they go, oh, it's catching on. It's a new trend, being savage. And I think the definition of savage in 1998 was clearly, according to the producers, a cowboy hat and a leather vest and a few tattoos. Because there's that scene where they go, oh, it's catching on. It's a new trend, being savage.
Right.
But I thought that was pretty funny.
And I think what's also kind of ironic with all this too is like, that's around the time I would say that Burning Man started catching on. So here we have like, this annual event, which, kind of ironically in 2020 it was canceled for the first time in years because of, the coronavirus and stuff. But it was like an intentional savage land and stuff like that. So it's kind of like this weird kind of also, I don't even know if it's like, as we talk about often of, life imitating art and stuff. It's like kind of this, I don't know, like art creating a life, I guess.
Yeah. Or you could say that the Wicker Man from like whenever it was in the 60s or 70s maybe influenced that as well. I don't know.
Right.
But, yeah. I mean, definitely it's got a very 90s feel. I would say what was kind of, I mean, obviously one of the major differences is the attitude of some of the characters, in that Bernard Marx is quite happy to bring John back and isn't kind of put off by any of his behavior.
No.
And likewise, Lenina is also, when they go to Linda and John's house, her first reaction is actually one of kind of almost compassion and empathy.
Right,
it's like, because Linda's there going, oh, welcome civilized people. And their reaction isn't kind of disgust or saying how awful it is or making fun of it. It's more kind of like, oh, oh no, don't worry about it. This is all fine. Yeah. So it was weird. And I don't know, this is just a kind of a, because we'd been through the grunge music movement or something, but it was kind of, they were much more kind of empathetic characters than they are in other versions.
Right. Yeah, I feel like overall what they were looking to do is like kind of just, that to almost make it where the Brave New World is not so far off, and also that like, we're just about there. So in other words, like kind of, I think the Savage Land was like kind of actually our time, like kind of, in the 90s and stuff, according to this version. And, it's basically saying like, hey, like it's not going to take too much for us to, get to this dystopia and stuff like that. And so I think that's kind of like why they kind of, their approach was to basically, like you said, not to be like so put off by it and stuff like that.
And I mean, there's also a line that Lenina has later on where she says, we have a right to we have an unalienable right to happiness, which immediately made me think of like the Declaration of Independence, and that there's, the pursuit of happiness and things like that. It was kind of interesting. I think you're right. I think it's kind of like they feel like we're nearly there, and we're just sort of trying to adjust this potential dystopian future. You kind of it kind of feels like a gentler version of Brave New World, and you kind of feel like by the end of it, and they do kind of start to revert back to reading about history and things like this. It's kind of like, well, if we go too far in this direction, we can pull it back, no problem. It's kind of like the message of the 1998 version.
Right. I think it's also matches a little bit like kind of the original the George Bush Senior's approach of like, like kind of kindler, gentler nation, and kind of like it just kind of like where I think is almost like it intentionally or not a commentary that like what's the cost though of a kindler, gentler gentler nation.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And I mean, I would say this does seem like they don't seem quite so. I mean, one thing that's noticeable, a difference from the book and various versions, is whether there are police or not. Because in this one, I think there are police, aren't there? Towards the end, the Soma riots. There's a kind of
and then they're called in,
yeah, which is kind of I always kind of feel like a reflection of the rave parties getting out of control, and people getting worried about that, which is exactly what led to the criminal justice bill in the UK. But in other versions they're there, and they're not there necessarily. So like in the 2020 version, but yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, I don't remember them being there in the 1980 version. Or
they kind of came in just like their thing was like they would have, which actually I wonder like sometimes why we don't use something like this, but they come in with this summer gas and everything, and so so they're kind of like riot police, and then like you said, they only come in extreme circumstances and stuff, and I think that's what's interesting in each world, like each of these kind of dystopias, we really don't see like kind of like. It's not as though you go everywhere you go, right? Nowadays with the airport, you see like kind of armed guards with like assault rifles and stuff like that. I mean, that's something that like is something that like it's taking us some getting used to, in since post 9/11. But it's something that like before that you just really didn't have either and stuff. So I think that's like kind of like something that like we're in some ways like the dystopia that we're in now like kind of is its own kind of version. One of the things that kind of was also striking too was that like the death centers here, and that like in each version they show different ways of like the kids being conditioned and stuff, and this one definitely felt a lot like kind of the school we saw in Snowpiercer, where like they had like the teacher kind of leading them, and I mean again like I know each version has its own, but like this one felt very much like I don't know, like in some ways that like that they really wanted to portray this kind of way that these kids very much like kind of just would buy into like kind of how this is the way that things are, that we're they wouldn't even question it after that and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean it's. Yeah, there's a very heavy emphasis on the 98 version on conditioning, hypnopedic teaching, and the dangers of our children sort of like regurgitating back our conditioning back to us, and that lack of, as you said, the lack of critical thinking about what's happening. Because at the end, you actually have Lenina and Bernard both sort of critically assessing the society and trying to change it, and then you have the children just kind of like challenging them and saying, what are you talking about, basically, which was kind of interesting. And I think the other big message I got from this one was that there is the first time you have your sort of big bad using conditioning to coerce or force one of the deltas into doing something that they shouldn't. There's the murder, which is a very sort of striking difference from all the other different versions. So you've got, I mean, there's, they're really kind of hammering home this thing of your own freedom of thought, and, critical thinking is crucial so that you're not taken in by media conditioning, basically. But it was also, they had a very simplified, they didn't really go into the whole caste system at all.
No, I was going to say, exactly.
It was almost, I mean, they didn't even really explain it in the 1998. All you had was the alphas, and they had these guys in the factories who were the deltas, and none of it was really described. They had like the office workers described as a beta, but they really didn't lay it out or hammer that point home very much in this one.
And you didn't see like kind of the identical twins kind of thing too, the clones. So yeah, that's another key thing. And it's like the only thing you saw, like you said, was like kind of very upper class and very much the low class and stuff, and that was like kind of it. And I guess again, maybe part of it is like budget constraints, and then also like here we have like 90 minute thing where I think they just really were just like, hey, let's just kind of just cut out all the things that we feel is like kind of extra and everything, and then just like kind of do our version and stuff. And I think they achieved that overall. I mean, I think that's to their credit.
Yeah. I mean, it was quite a watchable 90 minutes, really. I think as well that the other major difference is we've kind of got a slightly different journey for John in this one, in that this was actually there was a lot of stuff in this that was actually repeated in the 2020 version, which was interesting.
That's true.
In this one, they tackle more the aspects of fame and novelty and what is the latest trend and the fashion in the, John the Savage is now starting trends in the society.
Right.
Everyone wants to interview him. So you have this media attention on the outsider, which you didn't really get in the book and you don't really get in the 1980 version. So it's all, now you've got, even more primitive or different is now seen as something that's desirable in the culture, which is really an expression, I would say, of how more we've become focused on our own individuality. Right. And the more individualized we get in society, the more these kind of things are exciting for us in a way.
I felt like it was a reflection of how like the cult of personality was really starting to kind of develop, we hadn't yet seen the Kim Kardashians and the, Paris Hiltons yet and stuff. But again, we saw, like, besides rave parties, Burning Man, like kind of, like that there was like kind of this subculture that was developing of people that, like I said, really wanted to like found, something hip or, cool about like something that was more primitive and stuff, and then developing kind of personalities. I don't know of anybody who like kind of was like a personality per se, but I imagine that like within, the Burning Man, kind of world, I guess, or culture, there's probably was like some key like kind of figures and like kind of that we're just, I think, just not aware of and stuff because we're not hip.
Yeah, no, probably is. Yeah, I mean, I guess Timothy Leary, Terence McKenna might be seen, or maybe sort of these sort of pioneers of psychedelia might be kind of like seen as some sort of maybe analogous character to that sort of thing, perhaps. But of course, he can't deal with society because he ends up sort of going mad on a roof and falling off a cliff. So again, but this is interesting. It's almost like a kind of a Princess Diana kind of style twist to the story, and that he's being hounded by the media and chased across the countryside, and it ends up with him dying, which was
so. Do you find that like him dying in like almost an accidental way more tragic or maybe more true to the the story then, or is him hanging himself like in the 1980 version? Is that like kind of I mean, that's a literal kind of translation from the book, but which one kind of really tells the story that you really want to tell, I guess, is maybe like the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's generally more hopeful, the 98 version. I mean, they make his death accidental, so you don't feel too bad about it, and it seems like Lenina and Bernard are kind of like redeeming themselves to some degree and in the society. I mean, it didn't feel as powerful, I would say. It didn't really strike me as a particularly good way to deal with John's character either, but an interesting difference anyway.
And I think in both ways, I guess either way, I think ultimately what the statement kind of, and we'll definitely get into, is this idea that like can an individual fit into the society, right? That's all about you're part of this part of this thing, this future world and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. The state of, is the natural state of a human being part of a society or being separate from it, or how much of this actually do we need to sort of accommodate into our lives? But,
so here we have, like kind of once again the MTV effect where everything's slick and like it's definitely out of the different versions. This is the one that kind of like they kind of really seem to just spare almost no expense. And I think part of the reason why is that like since Game of Thrones and some of these other kind of blockbuster shows, they just are more willing, like studios are much more willing to kind of throw big budgets at these productions and stuff. And and you really see it. I mean, with this one, I mean, there's so much like kind of, never mind the CGI and stuff like that, but it's just like, this kind of besides the world building, it's a multi-episode series and stuff like that. We have Harry Lloyd, who is actually a Game of Thrones character, that playing Bernard. Jessica Brown Finlay, who's no stranger to kind of big productions as part of Downton Abbey. And actually, I actually enjoyed her a lot as this character Charlotte Wells from the series Harlots and stuff.
Right.
And then finally we have John Alden Ehrenreich, who's Han from Solo. So yeah, I mean, you can't get I guess a more qualified cast, I guess, to star in a blockbuster series, so to speak.
Especially as he was a dystopian surrogate for Han Solo. Anyway, that's another story. Yeah, I mean, this was really, I was very happy that they decided to make a TV series and not like a movie remake of it, because I think there's so much in Brave New World that you can draw on that there is definitely scope for a TV series. And I think they did a really good job of exploring a lot of the themes in it really well. And I mean, it's partly written by Grant Morrison, who, has written lots of quite interesting comic books and other TV shows. So that was very encouraging. And there's a very good interview with him and Douglas Rushkoff, actually. Maybe we can stick a link in the description. But yeah, I mean, he was very much setting out to not have a big bad for the show. Kind of like the book. It keeps it all kind of balanced between the characters. He's a sort of an avid magic with a K user. So he has a very sort of interesting esoteric take on things, I think. And, he has this, he was really trying to make this a heroine's journey, so to speak. So that's the most kind of obvious difference with this, in that I really feel like Lenina was the main character pretty much in this series. So yeah, but that was the main things I got from the interview with him. But yeah, there was a lot of interesting stuff I liked in this. The one thing I didn't like, and I was very discouraged right from the beginning, was that it started off as a kind of a detective story, and I was like, oh, man, come on, man, give me a break. Another sci-fi TV show that's a detective story. But thankfully they didn't hold on to that for too long.
Right. Yeah, it's funny also that, like, the things he was saying that he was looking to achieve, though, like kind of not having like a big baddie, because here we have this character Indra, right, which is an artificial intelligence, which is kind of a little bit of a reminder, I feel like, of Westworld, and kind of and then also like the dystopia kind of thing too, that he didn't want to do something like 1984, but then like we definitely see, like, kind of once we have the other classes and stuff like that, it really kind of did feel like kind of this okay, if you're not part of the upper echelons, you're part of like kind of this very much a 1984 kind of world, I guess, of like other workers and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting blend of ideas in this. I mean, I think it's kind of draws on 1984 and Brave New World in a lot of the pieces. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the caste sort of system description, they do go into a lot of depth into describing the different types and the behaviors as well. And not only do they do that, they actually write funny scenes around the behaviors and the conditioning, which is great. You have Gary the Gamma, which who just does who just does whatever he's told, which is great. And the betas are all kind of like sex maniacs, and the alphas are the ones doing the thinking. And obviously the epsilons just do the work, but they make a good point of showing not only sort of describing that in detail, but also showing the lives of each of the different layers, which was great, because that was one of the things in the book, and you really wanted to see how each sort of layer worked, which I really enjoyed. What I thought was interesting, though, was that even though they went to great lengths to describe it, I don't think there was actually like a physical representation like the 1980 version. Like the epsilons were pretty attractive most of the time. It's kind of like everybody pretty much looked pretty good looking all through. Right. So it was, Yeah, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, I think that I think though is a kind of a, that's a result of identity politics. It would be you probably upset too many people if you really visually represented the things the way it's described in the book.
Right. I mean, even Linda, right? I mean, come on,
Yeah.
you have Demi Moore playing Linda, I don't know about like kind of what people picture in their minds, but like for me, like I definitely picture like the harshness and the age showing in a way that was, not anywhere near, Demi Moore. Like, I mean, even though like this is an older Demi Moore, which made it harder to recognize her and stuff, but she's still fairly attractive. I mean, that's so she fits into this overall like casting and stuff like that. But in terms of the kind of trueness to the book and stuff like that, it's like that's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, but I mean, they did make her a more interesting character because she then became, and in a way, what I liked about the way they so my interpretation of how they rewrote her character was that she was there basically to represent the sacrifice that a parent makes for their children, and really sort of hammer that home that she was. She's played this part, more of a positive influence, you would say, than perhaps the Johns of the other versions. And by her sort of making that sort of ultimate sacrifice, she becomes this sort of key part of John's character in a way, and also communicates to Bernard and Lenina, the power of, parenthood. That was the way I sort of interpreted. So she was a much stronger character.
Definitely.
Much more agency than any previous one. She's not just a sort of a aging drug addict.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. Yeah, that is true though. That like if there's any kind of weakness to the book, is the fact that like she's a very passive character and stuff like that. Whereas here, like you said, she's actively making that choice to sacrifice herself. It definitely shows that like she's like not just going to like have things happen to her and everything, which like kind of again like it's a much stronger character and it's I think effective in this story and stuff like that. On the other hand though too, like I don't know how far we want to kind of go. I guess we're covering the series as a whole anyway, but what's interesting is the ending. I feel like like now's a good time to talk about it, that like they that once again, major spoiler and all that kind of stuff, that they leave it open, and I thought that was an interesting choice because as you and I talked about offline, that like they were leaving it open for a second season and stuff. And I thought like this was a 1-season series. I mean, I just didn't even imagine like kind of that they were going to do anything like kind of beyond that. And I felt like it was effective in a way of like kind of leaving it open, and that was, and I guess maybe that's partially why they did it that way in the end, was that like they wanted to have something that was fairly, there was some kind of closure, but at the same time they did, like if they could get another season, they wanted to do it. So maybe that's ultimately the thing. But I feel like in terms of the story though, leaving it open didn't really show me that like, I don't know, like what you just said too about like, Linda's sacrificing herself and teaching something to, Lenina and Bernard. I felt like that didn't really happen with the way they ended things and stuff.
No, I think perhaps more with Lenina's character, less with Bernard. In fact, it's almost like, I mean, Bernard's it's a great performance by Harry Lloyd, and I really enjoyed his character in this. Because you almost feel like he is exposed to all of the sort of savageness, and he reacts against it. He goes completely against all of the sort of the pursuit of truth and beauty and all the other things that the John's character represents. And he's kind of, he's like the book, he's an outsider, which I thought was really good. And again, he feels cheated out of his rightful place, much like the sort of the original. But it's only, as I say, it's only his own sort of self-ambition or his selfish sort of needs that make him question his environment. And when he's actually made director, and when he's like the famous and the hot thing, he's perfectly happy in the new society.
Right.
So it kind of it sort of shows him, and I think his kind of the way it ends with him is more that just, you know, he's pretty much reached the top, and then the society falls out from underneath him, which has kind of obviously left him fairly adrift. But I just really enjoyed his his shameless self-promotion. And also as the kind of the soma distributor, I loved you know, the commentary on the, like, at any given situation he was trying to figure out what drugs to give people.
Right.
You know, the line where it's like, it's always so difficult at a funeral, I never know what color soma to give people, you know.
I thought that was an interesting kind of aspect that they really filled out, because you had like different colors somewhere. That's something you didn't have in the other versions and stuff. And they went to great detail. I kind of saw in another interview and stuff like that like, you know, like these are a combination of, like, sometimes it was actually a solid plastic pellet, but other times it was actual gel that they were, you know, ingest and stuff like that. So depending on what shot they were looking to get. You know, there's a lot of detail they put around just simply kind of like, you know, what does the actual soma look like? And they had these kind of Pez dispenser soma things.
I know, yeah. And of course you can drink it as well. They had all the soma drink, soma fizz, which I think is actually also in the book as well. But yeah, but I mean, I think one of the big differences in this is the way they've dealt with soma. Because for me, it gave you lots of interesting opportunities of when you can use it or when it's dispensed. Like for me, it became an analogy actually of cell phones. And I think that's because if you notice, there's kind of like any kind of bits where they're waiting around, Bernard would say to Lenina, soma for the wait while we wait for the train. Right, you know, and it's like if there's something awkward, everyone's popping soma. Like when John walks into the Helm's kind of waiting area, and there's all of her entourage waiting there, and he says something, he gets up, sort of challenges someone, and then the entire room just pops a soma.
You hear the multiple clicks.
Yeah, you hear that. I mean, that's such a funny scene, but I mean, it reminds me of, like, you know, when you're on the subway and a homeless person comes in and says, "Hey, I need some food," and everyone's just like face down in their phones. Right. You know, and you know, we know from, you know, the various professors at MIT and how they've done a lot of this behavior modification with apps, that they're all based on sort of gambling techniques in order to give you a slight dopamine rush whenever you're sort of getting that satisfying click from Candy Crush Saga. So in a way, I feel like we're all kind of like self-administering our own little soma pellets from our dopamine, you know, clicking on our phones.
Definitely.
So yeah, I thought that was really insightful and a really nice kind of comment that they made with that. Likewise, on the other side, on the more extreme side, you know, they're also saying they're also using in traumatic situations, and how you know, in the worst scenarios, John is now in this one taking soma to forget about the pain that he's experiencing. So you're now looking at sort of psychoactive drugs and their part in society, and Lenina's character kind of getting rid of that so that she's not so numb with what's happening to her.
And
I don't know what your take.
The other thing was that they really filled out as well was the feelies, where, you know, like it's just kind of in some ways, or actually a lot of ways, it resembles like what we saw in the '98 version of stuff. Yeah. But at the same time, you know, they kind of got more into this idea that different times it was an experience. So adding the character of Watson and stuff really kind of show how you have like people who are like kind of creating these performances and stuff like that. And so the combination of like what people kind of, you know, expect when they go to like an Ibiza and stuff. And then there's like, you know, some DJ that kind of, you know, is flown in to play at the gig, or, you know, or a musician. I mean, you know, either way, it's somebody who like is creating this experience for these mass audiences and stuff. So I thought that was like kind of really like just a perfect kind of way that, you know, they're portraying on the one hand something that like, you know, isn't their interpretation of feelings, but the other like kind of doesn't feel too alien from what's happening now. So
absolutely. And I mean, I think what was more kind of modern and a more interesting interpretation was that the feelies now become basically more like orgies, and they are purely based on sensation. It's like there's virtually no narrative whatsoever. It's more just like an immediate, the whole thing of when he punches someone is almost like the whole feeling is just around like the punch, and that's it. It's just like a very like kind of like a meme, or it's just a real snapshot of a feeling or a sensation. There's the whole thing of like a narrative has completely gone out the window, which is much more of a sort of a modern take on it. And likewise with Helm, you've got the creative sort of frustration of constantly trying to come up with a new thing that's basically the same kind of thing, and this also internal struggle of trying to find more meaning, which actually harks back to the book a lot more accurately, I think. Because that's what Helmhotz Watson's frustration is. He's the creator of the narratives, and that's why he likes John and why he likes Bernard, because they're challenging the norms. And when he starts hearing Shakespeare, he's enraptured by it, and then can't actually exist in society because it doesn't hold any meaning for him anymore, because it lacks all that beauty and poetry. Which is kind of what they did with Helm in this as well, I would say.
And it's funny because in the other ones, the other versions, 98 and 1980, it's more about that his job is, and for that matter, it's a guy typically and stuff like that. And here we have, this actress and everything, and where they're doing jingles and stuff. And then so this one, it's actually, her kind of creating these feelings and stuff like that. So it's interesting how that was like a shift, that like it was, not so much about marketing or something like that. But it was still something that was consumed by the mass audiences and stuff. So that's something that is reflected and and I think that's something we'll as we kind of dive more deeper into the themes and stuff like that, it's really like just a interesting commentary about how besides the directors kind of managing kind of the status quo, stuff like that, you have people who are just either part of the system of creating more workers and or creating more consumption. That's really all that exists in this world.
Yeah, and I think it's also kind of what you touched on there, is it's a comment on advertising, because I've seen, you can watch adverts from the 80s where there was almost like a narrative and a joke a lot of the times. Like adverts were quite funny, and then then they became kind of subversive during the 90s, where you had sort of things that were kind of trying to be edgy. And now it's more sort of, it seems like they just try and convey very strong emotions. Like particularly in the UK during the COVID crisis, a lot of the adverts were just like, hi, we sell furniture. Let's all just care about each other and stay safe. How are you? It's a weird that's now become like the selling thing. It's like, have this, it'll make you feel fantastic. They haven't even tried to, again, it's like focusing down on just a very snapshot of a sensation or a feeling, and eradicating all kind of narrative from those things. So
until of course, as you kind of alluded to a little bit, is that John kind of comes into this world, and then he's like showing them like kind of the value of stories, and it's kind of reflective as well that like in the world of like marketing, there's this kind of like a resurgence of the interest in stories and stuff. It's kind of just to me like really mind-boggling or ironic that that what they're kind of reflecting is a little bit of like kind of that like we're discovering this thing called stories, and like I said, actually we've been doing this for ages and stuff, so it's like kind of funny that we've kind of lost that, and then now we're kind of it's this kind of renaissance of stories and marketing, and even like kind of media in general as well.
I think it's very obvious that there's two types of advertising now. There's like the TV advertising with the short snapshot, which is just pure sensation, and then you have like your internet marketing, which is like creating a story to kind of like get you in to click on whatever the product is. But I thought in terms of John's story, the Savage Lands are a much more interesting interpretation in this one.
I
mean, they've taken this whole idea that the people from the civilized land go to the savage lands of what is basically kind of like
Disney World for
Disney World of rural sort of white trash America, more or less.
Yes.
And but the interesting thing for me was that like they've themed it now like a theme park, which was really, and it's like you can, by kind of separating and clearly delineating these different sort of feelings that or trends that go along with old style living, like the house of want and the house of monogamy. These were all really sort of things to make you completely abstract you from the human emotions that go along with it. That was a really, really interesting thing to do. But what really made me laugh was the fact that you could experience all this with all the comforts of home, drugs and orgies, basically.
Right.
That was really hilarious.
And I think that's a real kind of statement about how, like, different times that's like when we, go on these vacations, right? It's like we want to experience something foreign, but only if we still have the comforts of home. Like that's really just general kind of approach to travel nowadays. We want adventure, but in measured doses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, this was much more heavy-handed commentary on inequality and class differences.
Okay.
Because, I mean, I don't know if you've heard, but, the ultra wealthy now will go on these kind of surprise adventure vacations where they don't know what's going to happen to them. And they just pay this money, and it can be like they've got to go and scale a mountain, or they've got to go and,
Interesting.
do something dangerous. But the whole idea is that it's not just you sitting around. It's like a slightly challenging vacation where you kind of, you've got some stories to recount when you come back. So that very much reminded me of how these alphas were going out to the savage lands.
Right.
But it also kind of taps into a very kind of middle and upper class thing of like poverty porn, which is a lot of, you see a lot of on TV, and it's kind of, you see people watching, stories about sort of people on the edge who are in desperate struggles, and so that they can go around and sit around a coffee mug and say, oh, isn't it awful what happens to those people? Oh, yes. So I think it really tapped into that kind of mentality of like, you can go and do charity work because your husband's a rich stockbroker or something like that. And so that I thought was really insightful. But also what I liked was how this kind of spun into John's story of like, he's there recounting his life when he returns with them. And, the way his whole sort of journey is like this circle of fame, in that he's initially very kind of like enjoying all the perks of being the novel person in the new society, going to sleep with lots of people and being the center of attention, and then him sort of slowly embellishing these stories to make them more and more extreme to keep the novel going, or novelty going, and then sort of reaching that peak of when people stop being interested, and then he's kind of becoming more introspective and realizing this all is a very sort of hollow appreciation of who he is. I thought that was amazing, kind of like encapsulated kind of story of fame that we could probably attribute to child actors and various other people we've talked about in these things. So
definitely.